Hello, everyone. This week we're going to take a look at nationalism, and this is going to help us to frame the discussion that we're going to have with World War One and some of the art and propaganda that comes out of it. We've been taking a look at art and propaganda and in terms of what they are to start our definition of kind of a basic definition of what they are. This definition is perhaps going to change and evolve to some extent as it becomes more complicated and as we start to grow and understand more of the depth and the complexity to them. But I want you to begin applying those, preliminary discussions that we've had about what art and propaganda are in terms of nationalism. And as we think about this, right, as getting back to the first part of the semester, I had you watch a couple clips from Shrek, and I suggested that a big part of this semester that's going to bring everything kind of together, or at least that's going to be something that threads a lot of the content together, is the idea of identity. And so today we're going to take a look at identity and how nationalism creates this sense of self. A couple of thoughts to think about as we talk about nationalism as I introduce this topic to you. The first question is, what would it take for you to give your life for something, right? So you're going to lay down your life. What would you lay down your life for, right? So just kind of pause the video for a minute and kind of jot down some of your notes on what would that entail? What would it look like? What would be the scenario that would cause you to sacrifice your life, right? Coming back, just kind of think about that a little bit more. A lot of people, notice or they jot down family or friends or their nation, right? And these are all good and virtuous things. And a lot of people write down religion, which is great. Another thought to think about within this is what would it take for you to take a life for something? Right? So same thing, pause the video here and jot down something that, or some things that that would cause you to take someone else's life. Okay, coming back, I want you to think about these two questions. I want you to think if you see them as the same or if you see them as totally different. Some people see these questions at the core, at the root, as exactly kind of the same kind of responses, the same kind of ideas. Some people see them as totally different. And as we move to World War I and start taking a look at that, this becomes an important question. This idea of sacrifice for your nation and the ability to get someone to take their life for their nation, right? And what was interesting about World War I is as they were training the soldiers to go out and to kill the enemy, what they found is that people were much more willing to give their life than they were to take a life. And soldiers were actually throwing down their weapons rather than shooting the enemy on the other side. And so what each nation had to learn and to change as a result of this is rather than in the basic training having the circle targets, they moved them to the silhouettes. And so if you're just shooting a target, right, you're not really kind of, gearing your mindset towards taking a life. But if you're shooting and your target practice is silhouette, then mentally you're actually preparing for it. And so it's kind of an interesting turn that we see in the 20th century that this idea of giving your life and taking your life becomes extremely important as nations start to construct an identity, as they start to construct their own kind of initiatives to go off and to battle for supremacy. So just some thoughts to consider. A couple of other thoughts that I want you to think about as we move forward through today is this question here. What is nationalism? When we hear that term, we hear it a lot. What is the term nationalism? What is it about nationhood that makes people feel united? And I want you to identify, just kind of pause the video again and just identify some common characteristics that nations have that provide a feeling of unity. And so as we think about Canadians, right, we can think of a couple of characteristics that come immediately to the mind, right? Or so we think about people from England. There's going to be some characteristics that we'll think about, right? Or as we think about people from Russia or people from Iran or something like that, we can generally think about some common characteristics that they all have. And so, as we think about this, what is it that makes people feel united, that gives them that sense of an identity? And certainly, people from the United States have that sense of unity, that sense of identity. And so, what is it about nationalism that causes people to feel united? So coming back, some of the things that people notice about what it is that makes people feel united is perhaps a language, a common language, a common history, a common geographic location, a common culture or a heritage, right? So these are kind of the things that make people feel united. And this is going to be important as we start to pull apart the propaganda. We're going to have to notice what these elements are, how they're functioning to get us to see the world and perceive the world in a certain way, right? So it's something to consider as we move forward. And nations are going to use this in the 20th century and even into the 21st century to get at a sense of a collective identity, right? We often hear whenever there's a political election, this is the real America, right? Or the real United States. What does that mean, right? And so they're generally calling upon a certain kind of criteria or characteristics. The second question I want you to think about is how might nationhood relate to herd mindset? As we talked about some of the terms of propaganda last week, one of the terms that we examined was herd mindset. And this idea of people acting or behaving in a certain way without really thinking about it, right? Just kind of going along with the flow. And so, how might nationalism relate to that? And a kind of a follow-up question to that is, how do you see that, right? Can you identify uh, common events or common ideas where you see people acting in a certain way just because that's the way they're supposed to behave, right? And this is going to be key for World War I and World War II and all the subsequent wars that will follow. And then the third question to think about is this one. It could be argued that nationhood is a social construct. Again, getting back to these previous terms that we talked about last week as we started to develop a language so that we can have a common reference point as we move forward this semester. How might nationhood be considered a social construct and our national identity part of social conditioning, right? So again, a couple of terms that we talked about last week, social construct and social conditioning. So you need to know what those terms mean. And then I want you to apply that to nationhood, right? What might this mean and how might this change how we view nationalism if nationhood is a social construct created by society? And this idea of patriotism and duty, sacrifice, commitment towards your country is a part of just social conditionings. Things like in the United States, we have the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. We have children pledge their allegiance to the flag, right? How might that help to shape our view of ourselves, the view of our community, the view of our nation, and how might, the repetition of that create a certain mindset, and how might that shape our view of the world, right? And so again, as we go through today, another kind of follow-up question would be, is nationalism a positive or negative force, right? So as we kind of move forward with the idea of how nationalism relates to propaganda, right? Is there propaganda of nationalism creating a sense of identity, right? And for this, I wanted to turn to Shakespeare and Hamlet. And this quote here, we're not going to read a lot of Shakespeare this semester. It's because this semester focuses more on the 20th and 21st centuries. Uh, but this one, I think, summarizes a lot of what propaganda and nationalism is all about. And in this particular point in the play, this is Act 4, Scene 4, Hamlet has been exiled from his homeland of Denmark. He believes that his uncle Claudius has killed his father, Hamlet Sr., and now he's been debating whether he wants to act and avenge his father's death. And rather than acting, he kind of allowed forces to act upon him. and he allowed Claudius to exile him. And so on his way to, I believe it's England, he decides to kind of escape and from, because his uncle sends him to England. He decides to kind of escape, and he sees these soldiers on a battlefield preparing for battle. And this is what Hamlet thinks about as he contemplates these soldiers. He says, "When honor's at stake, I see the imminent death of 20,000 men. For a fantasy and trick of fame, go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot, whereupon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent enough to hide the slain." And so what he sees here is these 20,000 soldiers that are going to fight for a piece of land that's not big enough to bury the dead that are fighting for it, but yet they're willing to do it, right? And so within this point of the play, Hamlet kind of has an epiphany, and he starts to think about, changing his behavior, and he goes back to Denmark. This time he's determined to act against Claudius, the now king, in an act of mutiny, an act of treason is what he's kind of, debating here. But he sees these 20,000 men, and he's inspired by their act of bravery, their act of valor and courage to fight for something so small, right? But the follow-up question I have for this is, why do we ascribe so much importance to geographical boundaries that we're willing to die and to kill for it, right? As we think about, what makes, for instance, I'm in the United States, what makes the United States better, land better than the neighbors of Canada or Mexico, right? What makes Switzerland better than France or Italy? Or what makes Japan better than China, right? Is it not just the geographical boundaries? Is one piece of land better than another piece of land? And in some ways we can make the argument, well, some has more more natural resources to it, more farmland or more minerals or whatever the case may be. But in a sense, right, it's a plot of land. And why do we ascribe that this plot of land in whatever country it is so much better than this other plot of land? And we do this more locally as well, right? That this in Rexburg we have people what are known as the people that live quote unquote on the hill, and they're considered the hill people, and generally they're the kind of deemed to be, somewhat superior, whatever that means, to the people like myself who kind of live not on the hill. We generally do this from, area to area or city to city. The people that live, quote unquote, across the tracks, right? As we think about, or on the wrong side of the street, we tend to ascribe so much importance to a given area. And is this not all just human-made boundaries and human-made superiority? Something to perhaps think about. I wanted to share three poems with you as we think about nationalism, whether it's a positive or negative force. The first poem comes from the 19th century, and it demonstrates the 19th century view of war. And then we're going to take a look at two poems from the 20th century to see how this changes, right? The view of war starts to change. The view of nationalism starts to change. And so as we take a look at Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, which was featured in the film The Blind Side. So if you've seen that, you kind of are somewhat familiar with this. Some people study this poem in high school, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. But it really does encapsulate this old idea of what war is all about, the idea of going to fight for God and country, right? And so just kind of to read through this quickly. And this is about the battle between the English and the Russians, and what happens within this particular scenario is that someone on the English side, one of the commanders on the English side, made a mistake that caused thousands. And so this is one of the major losses to England. And so we have Tennyson writing this poem about that loss. I want you to get the sense of the tone and the tenor, and what's he actually arguing about this loss. He says, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew that someone had blundered, right? And so no one was dismayed, even though they knew that one of their leading officials had died or had made a mistake. And the soldiers say, theirs is not to make reply, theirs is not to reason why, theirs is but to do and die, right? So that's kind of the main purpose of a soldier. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouths of hell rode the 600. Flash all their sabers bare, flash as they turned in the air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered, then they rode back, but not the 600. Right, so it's kind of an interesting. Why I want you to think about why they're memorializing this loss. What's the effect of this? Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that fought so well came through the jaws of death back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them left the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made, honor the light brigade, noble 600. And so, thinking about this poem, what does the poem celebrate? And why is it celebrating a defeat? Right? And well, what's being honored here? What's being valued, right? And I want you to think about this, the second question as well. How might this help to create a sense of nationalism, right? What is nationalism? How might this fit into that? So let's take a look at, so that's kind of the 19th century view of war, right? People going off to die for God and country. Let's take a look at the 20th century and see some differences that you might notice as we go forward. This one comes from Thomas Hardy in 1902, and it talks about another conflict in England that they were undergoing, and he has a different kind of mindset for this particular poem, a different kind of focus. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a napperkin. But range his infantry, and staring face to face, I shot at him, and he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so my foe, of course, he was. That's clear enough. Although he thought he'd enlist, perhaps, offhand, like just as I was out of work and sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes, quaint, curious war is. You shoot a fellow down. You treat if met at any bar is, or helped to have a crown. And so it's a different kind of mindset about the effects of war, the effects of nationalism, right? The fact that he doesn't really even know why he's fighting and why he's killing, and the fact that the enemy to him is the same as him, the same struggles, the same concerns, the same lack of reason for going to war, right? The only thing that the reason why they went to war is because they were out of work, right? And so then we have to think about, well, why would people who generally would be friends in any other circumstance kill each other, right? This gets back to our initial question. What would it take for us to sacrifice a life, and what would it take for us to take a life, right? And how does nationalism play into that, right? So as we think about this, how is this tone different from Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, right? What's the different kind of focus? What's the different kind of message? As we see with Tennyson, the Charge of the Light Brigade, what's kind of, how is he approaching war? And how is war approached differently, right? So it's kind of a difference between a kind of a telescope and a microscope, right? With Tennyson, we see kind of an overall survey of these soldiers who were willing to die to commemorate their sacrifice. In this one, we see, rather than kind of the whole view from someone just kind of writing about a group of 600 people willing to die, this is the individual experience of one soldier and their kind of inner conflict as they're struggling to kind of come to terms with what they've been asked to do. And so as we think about that, the other question I want you to think about is, what commentary is this poem making? right? About war, about nationalism. Taking a look at another poem, Dulce et Decorum S. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. I want you to think about how do we see similar ideas that we see with Hardy and the man he killed, right? And this one comes from World War I, and this is taking a look at some of the challenges that soldiers were facing with the invention of chemical warfare, right? So we see the use of mustard gas, and so mustard gas is going to come into play here. And sorry, I'm battling with the neighbor who chose this moment to take out his leaf blower and to blow his lawn, so bear with me. Bent double like old beggars under sex, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. Till the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, right? So again, think what that means, right? They're asleep, right, because of tiredness, because of exhaustion, but are they also perhaps asleep because they've been kind of manipulated or directed by nationalism? So maybe they're mentally, emotionally, kind of spiritually asleep as well. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. And so as we think about this, their bodies are fatigued, right? They don't have any boots, and so their feet are now all bloody, and they're lame, they're blind, right? They're drunk with fatigue, and they're lost the capacity of their senses, right? That they're no longer human beings, they're now just machines, right? And that's kind of an interesting representation to the point where they don't even hear the gas shells of the mustard gas dropping behind them. Someone says, gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man on fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes in thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the wide eyes wreathing in his face, his hanging face like devils sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood came gargling from the froth corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro mori. And so as we take a look at this, right, this is a very different kind of feeling, a very different kind of tone than what we would see with Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. It's much more intimate. It's much more about the individual experience. And we see the use of chemical weapons, which we're going to talk a little bit more about when we talk about World War I, that are being introduced into war in order to create massive deaths, right? In order to bleed the other side to death. And it's quite questionable how much chemical weapons actually were used in World War I. They were used to some extent, but not as widespread as we tend to think. Mainly what chemical weapons did is they imposed this great psychological trauma of the fear of what could happen. And so on the bottom here you see some images from the war as he was just kind of sketching his experiences. And here you see a soldier dying in the trenches on the right, and you see the gas attack on the left. And so it's just some things to think about, a different type of different view of war that we see, and similar ideas that we see in the poem that I had you read for today, Siegfried Sassoon's Survivors, right, where they're talking about this idea of the soldiers and their experiences, right? So no doubt they'll soon get well. The shock and strain have caused their stammering, disconnected talk. Of course, they're longing to go out again. These boys with old scarred faces learning to walk, they'll soon forget the haunted nights, their cowed subjection to the ghosts of friends who died, their dreams that dripped with murder, and they'll be proud of glorious war that shattered all their pride. Men who went out to battle grim and glad, children with eyes that hate you, broken and mad. And so this is kind of from the perspective of a leader that says, yeah, these soldiers, yeah, they've seen a lot, but they'll get better, right? They'll be fine. The glory that they will now enjoy is something much more than the horrors that they experience. And so again, this poem is coming out of World War I, to kind of mocking that mindset that's so dismissive about the realities, the brutality of war. And so again, to think about these ideas. What would it take for you to give your life for a nation? What would it take for you to take a life for a nation? So some thoughts to kind of think about as we go through the online lectures this week. And again, so some things to think about as we move forward is, what is the difference between art and propaganda that you've observed in terms of nationalism and war? And so as we move forward and talk about art and propaganda that came out of World War I want you to observe the differences between them, right? How does art function and how does propaganda function, right? What are some similarities and what are some differences that you notice, right? How do they capture reality and truth differently? Because that's going to be key. Another question to consider is, how should we view nationalism? Is it virtuous? Is it evil, necessary, unnecessary, useful, not useful? Again, something to think about. I'm not going to tell you, what to think. You're going to have to come to your own consensus on how we kind of make sense of what nationalism is. And I do want to suggest that nationalism is different from patriotism, right? I know that I'm kind of pushing you guys here on this idea of nationalism because a lot of us, particularly in the United States is very proud of, the nationalist kind of mindset. And so I'm kind of pushing you to think a little bit differently than what the propaganda teaches us, and the social conditioning of what we've been taught throughout the years. But again, I want you to kind of give an honest look on how should we view nationalism. And just to kind of close here, I wanted to leave you Elder Ballard. And Elder Ballard says this. He says, "We need to embrace God's children compassionately and eliminate any prejudice, including racism, sexism, and nationalism." Right? I want you to think about why he includes that as a prejudice, right? And how does God view us? Does God view us as different nations, or does he view us as mainly just his children, right? He continues on. He says, "Let it be said that we truly believe the blessings of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ are for every child of God." And so as we think about, as what do we do now? How do we move forward? How are we to view ourselves, our identity? And how do we kind of view where is truth in all of this? We have to be able to kind of separate the propaganda. We have to separate some of the social constructs and the social conditioning that we have to be able to see kind of some of the truth that's out there, and to push past some of the ideas that we've been influenced by. So we're going to take a look at World War I next, and then we're going to kind of finish off with taking a look at some art that comes out of World War I.